The room went quiet when Bumpy Johnson didn't move. His guard felt the insult land before the words finished, finger tightening. Knowing one small click could either end the night, the room wasn't loud to begin with. It never was when Bumpy Johnson sat down. Smoke hung low, unmoving, like it respected the stillness. Glasses stayed on the table longer than necessary. Chairs didn't scrape. Men learned small habits around Bumpy, how to breathe slower, how not to reach too fast, how to finish their thoughts carefully. Tonight was no different. Until it was, the insult didn't come sharp. That's what made it dangerous. It slipped out dressed as confidence, maybe even humor, a half smile, a tone that assumed permission. The kind of remark a man uses when he thinks the room belongs. To him now, Bumpy didn't blink. He sat back, hands relaxed, eyes steady. Not angry, not curious, just present. That presence pressed down on the air like weight. Everyone noticed. His guard, before they noticed the speaker, stopped talking. The guard stood just behind Bumpy's right shoulder, close enough to feel his breath, close enough to hear the subtle change when Bumpy inhaled deeper, not a signal, not an order. Just a moment. The guard's hand moved on instinct. Leather creaked softly as fingers wrapped tighter around the grip. The pressure was familiar, trained, calm. The metal felt colder than it should have. His finger rested against the trigger. Not pulling, just acknowledging it. That's when the room truly went silent, not the polite quiet from before. This was different. This was the sound of men realizing time had slowed without asking them. Eyes shifted. Someone swallowed too loud. A chair leg adjusted, then froze halfway through the movement like it had been caught doing something wrong. The man who spoke the insult felt it last. He saw the guard first, then the gun. Then Bumpy still not looking at him. That hurt more than anger would have, because anger could be negotiated. Silence could not. Bumpy finally lifted his eyes. They didn't harden. They didn't narrow. They didn't flare. They simply met the man's face, level and patient, like he was deciding whether this moment deserved to exist at all. No one spoke. The guard waited. He wasn't nervous. That was the worst part. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't eager. He understood his role perfectly. He was there to act if the world tilted too far. And right now, the world was leaning. Bumpy adjusted slightly in his chair. Not a command, just a shift of weight. A reminder that he was comfortable, that he was not rushed. The insult still hung in the air, unclaimed, uncorrected. That's when everyone understood something important. Whatever happened next wouldn't be about the gun. It wouldn't be about the insult. It would be about whether Bumpy Johnson needed to prove anything at all. The guard's finger tightened, just a fraction. Enough to feel the click that could come. Enough to know that if it did, nothing would ever be the same again. But Bumpy didn't speak, and the silence stretched longer than violence ever could. Outside that room, Harlem kept moving. Streetlights buzzed. Doors opened and closed. Music drifted through windows like memory. Dice hit pavement. Mothers called their children in before the air turned mean. Life didn't stop just because tension lived somewhere else, but Harlem felt it anyway. Bumpy Johnson's power never announced itself. It traveled, quietly, through habits, through stories told without names attached. through the way men stood when he entered a space, even if they pretended not to notice. He didn't need to raise his voice. Harlem had learned to listen without sound. The people knew the difference between noise and authority. Noise demanded attention. Authority didn't ask, it waited. Bumpy waited better than anyone. He walked these streets without hurry, without escorts most days. Not because he lacked protection, but because protection followed him in ways that couldn't be counted. Loyalty, memory, gratitude earned the hard way. He had fed families when nobody was watching. He had corrected men without humiliating them. He had punished when necessary and stopped before it became chaos. That restraint built something stronger than fear. So when whispers moved through Harlem about a man getting too comfortable, about a line being tested, they didn't sound like gossip. They sounded like concern, because everybody understood one truth. Bumpy Johnson didn't rush moments. When disrespect appeared, he let it show itself fully. Let it expose who carried it and why. Harlem respected that patience. It meant consequences would be precise, not emotional, not sloppy. Inside the community, that mattered. Children played on corners that stayed calm longer than they should have. Shopkeepers kept their lights on later. Old men sat outside and talked about the past without lowering their voices. That wasn't accidental. That was order without uniforms. So when men talked about Bumpy, they didn't talk about how many people he'd hurt. They talked about how many. Problems never happened because he was there. Back in the room, the silence still lingered. And outside, Harlem waited not for violence, but for balance to be restored the way it always was, slowly, deliberately, on Bumpy's time. The pressure didn't come wearing anger. It never did. It arrived clean, polished, dressed in confidence that hadn't earned its place yet. The kind of confidence borrowed from proximity to power, not built from surviving it. The man testing Bumpy smiled too easily, talked too comfortably. He acted like the room had shifted before anyone else noticed. That's how pressure works when it thinks it's smart. He didn't threaten, not directly. He suggested, he implied. He framed his words like opportunities, like favors being offered instead of lines being crossed. Bumpy listened. He always did. Listening made men forget themselves, made them fill the quiet with explanations they didn't plan to give. The longer Bumpy stayed silent, the more the man revealed not just what he wanted, but how badly he wanted Bumpy to react. That was the mistake, because pressure only works when it shortens time, when it forces decisions, when it creates urgency. Bumpy didn't live in urgency. He lived in outcomes. He let the man talk, let him reference names that didn't belong in the room, let him lean just a little too far forward, let him believe he was negotiating from equal ground. Around them, other men stayed still. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody helped. They were watching the balance of the room shift, not toward violence, but toward exposure. The god remained where he was. No movement now, no tightening, no warning. That alone told the story. If the god wasn't tense, it meant Bumpy wasn't threatened. And if Bumpy wasn't threatened, then this wasn't a confrontation. It was a test. The man finally stopped talking, waiting for something. Approval, rejection, anything. Bumpy met his eyes again. Still calm, still measured. No raised voice, no warning, just a pause long enough for the man to realize he'd said too much. and not enough to take any of it back. Pressure, when it fails, leaves a mark not on the one it was aimed at, but on the one who applied it. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood who was being weighed. Disrespect doesn't spread by accident. It's carried, passed carefully, measured in reactions. Men don't repeat a story unless they're testing how safe it is to say out loud. By morning, the words had moved, not the full insult, just the shape of it. Enough to reach the corners where opinions form. Enough to make people wonder if something had changed. It hadn't, but Bumpy let the question exist. He didn't send messengers, didn't correct the rumor, didn't close doors or raise walls. He walked Harlem the same way he always did, steady, unguarded, unbothered. That unsettled people more than anger ever could, because when power feels threatened, it reacts. When power feels secure, it observes. Men watched to see if Bumpy would rush to reclaim respect. He didn't. He shook hands. He listened. He remembered names. He handled business like the insult never touched him. That was the point. The disrespect wasn't meant to offend. It was meant to provoke, to draw Bumpy into motion before he chose it, and he refused. Every step he took without reaction turned the insult back on the man who started it, made it smaller, made it look desperate. The community noticed. Shopkeepers nodded a little deeper. Conversations ended when Bumpy passed, not out of fear, but out of understanding. People knew something was being allowed to unfold, not chaos. Clarity. By the time the story reached the men who mattered, it had changed. Now it wasn't about what was said. It was about the silence that followed. And silence, in Harlem, always meant someone was about to learn where they stood. The room felt smaller the second time. Same walls, same smoke, same chairs. But now everyone knew what could happen there. The man returned with less confidence than he arrived with before. He sat straighter, spoke slower. His smile didn't last as long. Bumpy noticed everything. He acknowledged nothing. The guard took his position again. Same place, same distance. Muscle memory intact. The weight of the gun familiar in his palm, not as a promise, but as a possibility. This time, the insult didn't come dressed as humor. It came quieter, more careful. A final attempt to save face without surrendering pride. The kind of line a man uses when he hopes restraint has softened into tolerance. It hadn't. Bumpy let the words land. Then he did something unexpected. He leaned forward, not fast, not sharp, just enough to close the space. The movement alone commanded attention. Chairs creaked this time, but nobody corrected it. Bumpy spoke softly, almost conversational. Not a threat, not a warning, a statement of how things worked. Short sentences, clean, final. The guard felt it before the words finished. His finger pressed just enough to feel resistance. The moment before the click. The moment where intent becomes irreversible. The room held its breath. Bumpy raised a hand. 2 fingers. Low, calm. That. 2 fingers. Low, calm. That. Ruma held its breath. Bumpy raised a hand. 2 fingers. Low, calm. That. Lay, calm. Was all. The guard released the pressure. No click. That was the lesson. Everyone saw it. Everyone understood it. Violence hadn't been avoided because it wasn't possible. It had been avoided because it wasn't necessary. The man nodded. Once, not in agreement, in recognition, he had been spared something. Worse than death, he had been spared. Becoming an example, Bumpy leaned back again. The room exhaled. Nothing else needed to be said. Harlem didn't hear about a gun that day. It heard about a man who didn't need one. Stories traveled the way they always did, through barbershops, storefronts, back rooms, late-night walks home. Not exaggerated, not glorified, clean, controlled, like the moment itself. People didn't say, Bumpy Johnson spared someone. They said he decided something. That distinction mattered, because sparing implies mercy. Deciding implies authority. Men who lived by noise kept their distance after that. Not because they were afraid of death, but because they understood. Something worse existed. Irrelevance. Bumpy's restraint became the message. Not just to enemies, but to his own people. Violence was available, but never careless. Power was present, but never loud. That balance kept Harlem standing. Children grew up hearing the lesson without being told directly. Respect first, patience always, consequences when necessary, order without cruelty. Years later, when names changed and faces faded, the story stayed, not the insult, not the gun, not even the moment. What stayed was the silence, the pause where a city watched one man choose legacy over impulse and understood why he had lasted so long. That's how Harlem remembered Bumpy Johnson, not for what he did, but for what he never had to.